that keep racism alive by perpetuating the lie that some members of the family are inferior and others superior. Create in us a new mind and heart that will enable us to see brothers and sisters in the faces of those divided by racial categories. Give us the grace and strength to rid ourselves of racial stereotypes that oppress some of us while providing enlightenment to others. Help us to create a church, a nation, and a community that embrace the hopes and fears of people of color where we live, as well as those around the world. Heal your family, God, and make us one with you, in union with our brother Jesus, and empowered by your Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
And now to Steve Schneck, our Executive Director, who will facilitate the event.
Thank you, Sister Maria. It's my pleasure this evening to introduce our two panelists for the conversation this evening. The first panelist, Olga Marina Segura, is the opinion and culture editor at National Catholic Reporter and is the author of Birth of a Movement, Black Lives Matter and the Catholic Church, a book, by the way, that I heartily recommend. Previously, she was the associate editor at America Media, where she wrote and solicited articles on race and culture. Her writing has appeared in The Guardian, Shondaland, Sojourners, Refinery 29, and The Revealer. Prior to working at America Media, Olga was an intern at the Permanent Mission of the Dominican Republic to the United Nations. She graduated from Fordham University with a Bachelor of Arts in English and a Bachelor of Arts in Italian Language and Literature. She speaks Italian and Spanish fluently and was born in Santo Domingo, the Dominican Republic. She's a rising young star among Catholic journalists, and we here at Franciscan Action Network are so very pleased that she's here with us. Our second panelist is Ralph McCloud. Ralph is the director of the Catholic Campaign for Human Development, CCHD, an anti-poverty program of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. CCHD is the domestic anti-poverty program of the U.S. Catholic Bishops. He is a recipient of the Texas Courage Award from the Texas Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty, the History Maker Award from the Archdiocese of Atlanta, Catholic Charity USA's Keep the Dream Alive Award, and the Bishop John Joseph Keene Medallion from the Catholic University of America. He currently serves on the board of Catholic Mobilizing Network, and Ralph is a member of St. Teresa of Avila Parish in Washington, D.C. Let me add too that Ralph is a dear friend, and I'm personally so very grateful to have him with us this evening. So welcome. Given the short time that we have to talk, let's dive right in. And my first question is to you, Olga. At the heart of Fratelli Tutti is the parable of the Good Samaritan. I wonder if we could ask you to give us a sense of what that parable looks like through the lens of anti-racism and racial justice. As we all remember, a person was traveling, sojourning, we might say, and then attacked by robbers, passed by a Levite and a priest, yet ministered to by an outcast, an untouchable, the Good Samaritan. So what does this story tell us, Olga, about our concerns about racism?
I just want to start off by thanking Steve and the entire Franciscan Action Network for inviting me today, and I'm excited to be in community with Ralph today. Fair warning, you will hear my neighbors throughout the event, so just apologies in advance for that. But I think this is a really, really great starting question, Steve. And in the parable of the Good Samaritan, as you described, the Samaritan is the only person who we see who stops to help the injured man. He is the only one who stops and shows mercy for the person who is literally suffering right in front of him. A man who was not from the same world that he was from, who did not have the same lived experiences as he did. And it is, again, as you mentioned, this outcast who shows mercy. It's this outcast who really exemplifies what it means to follow in Christ's footsteps. And so to apply this parable, to apply the lessons of this parable to anti-racism work means that we do exactly what Pope Francis is calling us to do in Fratelli Tutti, which is Catholics who are doing anti-racism work, we must actively and consistently work, and I'm quoting him directly here, we must work to create a different culture in which we resolve our conflicts, in which we care for one another. And I think what has been so powerful to me about Fratelli Tutti is that I feel that he gives us a really solid blueprint for what it means to do this anti-racism work, for what it means to create this culture. And again, he might not say it in the document as explicitly as I'm about to say it right now, but the answer to create that culture means that we have to reject every system that leads to the oppression and suffering of human beings. We have to eradicate every system that prevents people, whether that's because of your social class, because of your race. We need to abolish systems that create any kind of suffering, the suffering that we're seeing in the parable of the Good Samaritan, right? What it means to exemplify mercy means, and again, I will say that I know this is a little more explicit that Pope Francis says, but to me, this means that we have to reject capitalism. We have to reject systems that create the inequalities that we're seeing. We have to eradicate systems that have conditioned us to believe that profit matters more than people. And this is, to me, especially in the context of Fratelli Tutti, this is what it means to do anti-racism work, right? You have to think about the systems that have created these inequalities, these systems that have perpetuated white supremacy. And this is something that Pope Francis, again, is where he's at his most challenging to me. You know, he challenges us to step outside of how we define what it means to do anti-racism work in America, right? This doesn't just mean let's abolish systems that are oppressive in the United States. This also means abolishing systems that are oppressive in Gaza, or in Rio de Janeiro, right? It means abolishing this type of suffering. So I think that for me, Fratelli Tutti really challenges us to center anti-racism work in anti-capitalist work. Again, I think Pope Francis really challenged us to criticize consumerism and to criticize how the culture of individualism in particular that we have in the United States really perpetuates racism and white supremacy. And of course, I will rant about this, I'm sure, throughout the conversation, but I want to open it up to Ralph as well to sort of share his thoughts about this as well.
Oh, well, it's I just want to say what a pleasure it is to be with you this evening. And I've long honored your work, and you're such a prophetic and welcome voice that we need right now in this conversation in this country. You know, I agree with you more, you know, the whole idea of the systems that are continuing to oppress people. But, you know, as my daughter would say, Pope Francis actually went there in talking about the characters in the Good Samaritan. He said, you know, oftentimes we find ourselves as one of the characters, either the Good Samaritan or the person who's bruised and abused by the road. But we also, as a society, as a community, we're the robbers. I mean, we're the ones who are responsible for the road being dangerous in the first place. We're responsible for the person directly or indirectly being beat up and bruised by the side of the road. We're responsible as being the person who walks past them and avoids and ignores. I mean, we're each one of those characters, and overcoming that in a context of dealing with racism and anti-racism work is where he invites us to be, is to deal with the systems that allow that kind of thing to happen. I mean, I like the way that the story where the Pharisee asked, you know, who is my neighbor? And then Jesus turned the story around, and you know, after he went through the entire story, he said, now you tell me who the neighbor is in this story. You tell me who it is. You identify the person who was the neighbor. And the whole notion of the Good Samaritan being so unselfish in that he jeopardized his own resources on the road. You have to assume he had resources because he paid the innkeeper. You have to assume that he made a public witness about what he did because he came back for the person, despite all the reasons of him being the least likely person to be the one to assist. He's the one that does it. And for Pope Francis to take it in Fratelli Tutti and use that as kind of the centerpiece for the gathering, for the conversation and how racism, and for our conversation this evening about how racism is impacted by that conversation. I think it's somewhat prophetic.
Yeah, no, I'm just blown away by both of your answers. I mean, I too, I just find it just such a marvelous way to think, not just about the question of racism, but in fact, you know, all of the ills of our contemporary world. I mean, I think it's just a terrific parable, and the way that His Holiness kind of opens it up, just I mean, every time I read it, it's better and better. Well, let me turn to a slightly different question. And this one's more specifically about race. In section 20 of Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis writes that he's talking about today, that, and here I'm quoting from him, a readiness to discard others finds expression in vicious attitudes that we thought long past, such as racism, which retreats underground only to keep reemerging. Instances of racism continue to shame us, for they show us that our supposed social progress is not as real or as definitive as we think. What do you think His Holiness is driving at here? And maybe you could start with this one, Ralph, if you don't mind. What does His Holiness mean? I mean, is this?
I think I understand the what he means, but I would disagree slightly in the notion of racism going underground. I mean, I think for folks who find themselves living in poverty and pushed to the margins of our society because for no other reason than because of race, it's not underground. It's obvious, apparent, and it's something that people live daily. But I do think that he was insightful in suggesting the underground nature to folks who feel that it's rising back up again. That it's and that the whole notion of it disguising itself in somewhat as we've heard over the last several years, living in a post-racial society, whatever that may mean. But the reality of how racism impacts people on a daily basis, I think he's trying to bring to the forefront that it's not gone, that it's in our DNA, that it's often disguised in in an illusion of inclusion. You know, just because that you know you can check off certain efforts and things that you've done to try to move towards it, to make, you know, oftentimes the white supremacists feel good, that racism still exists and is prevalent, that it hasn't gone away. And I think for a lot of folk, particularly church folk, are content with saying, you know, that's them. And I think Pope Francis even uses the them versus that's them, that's the other folks.
Yeah. I before we turn to you, Olga, I'd like to kind of push one aspect of this that the Pope mentions, and that's that we shouldn't be as confident about progress as maybe we. I mean,
I agree.
Is there some reason that we're? Well, I'm curious about the progress question. What do you think? Have we made progress on racism? Is progress possible? I mean, or is there something about our world that's holding us back from progress?
I think that we have been very successful in putting a Band-Aid on a very, could be a terminal wound. That I think that we're good at whipping out the Band-Aids and putting something on to make it make ourselves feel it out. I think there's been progress, but it's been so minuscule that it's oftentimes folks don't feel it. You know, one of the things I struggle with personally is, you know, telling young people and certainly telling my kids the same thing my parents told me and the same thing their parents told them, you know, that things are going to get better. They're going to get better on the horizon. And, you know, and as I get older, I feel like, you know, my parents and grandparents, you know, probably died feeling as though they failed or that they lied to us about how things were going to get better. I don't think it'd be hard for, you know, a couple of generations that just passed to fathom, you know, seeing what we've seen in terms of criminal justice, in terms of the lack of economic development, in terms of some of the housing things. So I think, you know, that while there's been progress, has been very, very, very minuscule. And for some folks, it's not progress at all. You know, they find themselves in worse situations than we did in previous years.
Olga?
Yeah,
Turn it to you. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with Ralph. I think that before I get into what I understand Pope Francis to be achieving in this section in particular, I think it's important, as Ralph mentioned, to say that racism has never, quote unquote, retreated underground only to keep reemerging. Racism has only evolved since the days of human enslavement, and systemic racism in the 21st century is extremely complex and involves virtually every industry in the United States, from healthcare to education to politics. And we know that throughout his papacy, Pope Francis has visited and centered communities most affected by systemic racism. So I think that he understands this complexity, even if I don't think his documents always reflect how deeply he actually is thinking about racism. But I think in order to understand that quote in particular, we have to connect it to the larger point that he's making in that section about our throwaway culture. And I think when I first read this section, this quote on racism, I thought, okay, Pope Francis is doing that thing that he does where he sort of is lacking what I say is a very intersectional lens that is required to talk about race. Mm-hmm. But I think now, especially in the context of everything that has happened in 2021, from the events on January 6th to the racial violence against the AAPI community to the oppression that we're seeing in the Middle East right now, I think I'm starting to understand more deeply that he's really challenging us to understand, again, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, I think he's really challenging us as Catholics to understand more deeply how that we need a historical and critical lens to understand. Again, I know I keep hammering home my anti-capitalist rhetoric today, but I think he's really, really challenging us to think about how these systems have perpetuated white supremacy, how these systems have conditioned us as a church and as a nation to commodify each other, to treat each other as a competition, to treat each other as inferior to one another, depending on race or class. And I think that he wants us in this section, I think I'm feeling really called by this part of Fratelli Tutti to understand that he wants us to think about community building and to think about that as being integral to the anti-racism work. And I think he understands that as Americans, I know for myself, I feel like it was me writing my book that I first fully understood, like, oh, wow, oppression is really this systemic thing that I had never been taught to analyze or to think about. And I think that that's what he does when he writes comments and when he uses rhetoric like this in Fratelli Tutti. I think he wants us to understand, like, yes, systemic racism is an issue, but here's how it's also related to the issue of capitalism. Here's how it's related to individualism. And I just think that he's really challenging, especially as a millennial Catholic, he's challenging me to connect those dots in a way that I never had before. And I didn't have this when I first read Fratelli Tutti in October. I remember reading it and thinking, wait a minute, Pope Francis feels really disconnected from like the suffering that so many of us are going through. But now I'm like, oh, okay, I see what you want us to do. You want us to figure out how to connect those dots as a Catholic community. So I think that that's what he's trying to say about anti-racism work in that section.
You guys, both of you have kind of opened the door for a discussion of the systemic quality of racism, or maybe more in the language of Pope Francis, the structural sin of racism. Let me just read a little bit from section 97 of the encyclical. He says there, racism is a virus that quickly mutates and instead of disappearing goes into hiding and lurks waiting. I think many white Catholics here in the United States have a hard time understanding what this means, this idea of structural sin and how racism is a structural sin. And that it isn't so much the however ugly and still present it isn't that sort of conscious in your face racism of the Klan. It's the racism in our housing patterns. It's the racism, in our education system. It's the racism in our policing and so forth. What can you guys offer white Americans as a way of kind of understanding that structural sin of racism, or systemic racism, to use the term that Olga has used here? Maybe you could start, Olga.
Yeah, I'm happy to, because I think this ties directly to the answer I was sort of giving for the last question. I think that discomfort is very real, because I think, and again, I'm speaking from our very specific American context, I think we're not encouraged to connect these dots and to sit with history in a way that would allow us to more fully understand what systemic oppression, what systemic racism truly is. And this is something that Pope Francis points out in the document as well, right? He says, and again, I'm paraphrasing because I don't have the document in front of me, but he says something like, you know, we have this human freedom has conditioned us to think that like people arrive in certain lands and zero history existed before that. And we, in the process of discovering new lands, we erase entire histories and we erase entire communities. And I think that is why we have such a difficult time defining what systemic racism is versus individual racism, right? I think that it took me, again, becoming an adult and writing a book to really realize, oh, okay, there's a difference between systemic racism, which includes policies and practices that are institutionalized that really exclude marginalized groups like Black and Brown Americans, versus individual acts of racism that happen to me and Ralph in our daily everyday life whenever we move through the United States. And I think that discomfort is very, very real. But I think, again, that's the challenge of Fratelli Tutti, right? You're supposed to understand that, hey, we've been taught history in a way that doesn't paint the full picture, but we have to challenge ourselves to understand what's the history that we've erased, what's the history that we've ignored, and how has that shaped how we talk about what it means to be racist, how we discuss white privilege, how we discuss white supremacy. And I think that, again, this is why I keep like bringing in home the historical aspect, because I think this is what's really speaking to me about the document, this need for Catholics to really understand not just our history, but even the church's complicity in systems of oppression throughout American history, right? I'm really, really grateful, and anyone who's read the book knows this, I'm grateful for Dr. Shannon D. Williams, who really was the first person who helped me to connect these historical dots. And I think that is why so many white Catholics in particular are like, wait a minute, I'm not racist because I didn't enslave human beings. And it's like, of course you didn't, but how have you benefited from these systems throughout generations, right? And I think that as a nation, we have to figure out as a church what it means to help people have those conversations, you know?
Ralph?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly agree 100%. And the only thing I would add is that I mean, using that very Catholic value of an examination of conscience, of wondering and looking at every system and saying, is it even possible? Is it I, my silence? Am I one of the robbers in the Good Samaritan story? Or am I one of them just passing by, just ignoring the situation? I think looking at every institution and taking one that's kind of fresh in our minds is that, you know, the George Floyd verdict, the verdict in the George Floyd murder, that you know, there was a modicum of folks, a population of folks who were doing a victory lap, who would say, you know, see, the system works. But the system worked because, you know, there were people who videotaped it, and millions of people had to see it. Millions of people had to take to the streets. Millions of people had to confront the system. And the reality of the system itself, the officers and the people who were around, they felt no fear of the criminal justice system themselves, because they felt a degree of safety, even though they were being videotaped. And so that they felt the system would protect them. So I said, fast forward just, you know, the last couple of days, a person who didn't have the benefit of 1 million people going to the streets, who didn't have the benefit of the kind of video taping and promotion in North Carolina, and the officers don't even get any kind of an indictment, even not saying that they have to be declared guilty, but they didn't even get a trial. Didn't even get that trial. So I think, you know, looking at systems that might be complicit, an example I would use is I have a home in Texas that I've had for like 15 or 20 years. But in the deed of that home that I bought in 15 or 20 years ago, it said that no one of African descent can buy this home. In the covenant, in the original deed, it said that can't happen. Now, obviously, it's unconstitutional now, but what that means for me and for my generation and all of my brothers and sisters is that I didn't have the benefit of my father being able to buy a house in that neighborhood because of that covenant. My grandfather couldn't have bought a house in that neighborhood. So my parents couldn't live there, and they couldn't pass on any kind of equity that, you know, my other high school classmates got from their father when they were going to college, or any other kinds of benefits from that. So the residual effects of some of those things that some of those institutions, including things like the criminal justice system, including things like housing patterns, including things like loans and redlining and those kinds of things, they have a profound impact on the life, the quality of life. And I think that's what Fratelli Tutti is saying, that denial of these sorts of things causes folks not to live up to the human dignity that God wants all of us to live up to. That the institutions are causing us and I think he even speaks to the whole notion of this doesn't just affect the person who's oppressed, it also affects the oppressor, mm-hmm. and that it causes them to be less of a person.
Mm-hmm. Well, that was a powerful example, Ralph. Thank you for sharing something so personal. I really appreciate it. What Fratelli Tutti advocates for our contemporary world as a solution really throughout is community or solidarity, concern for the common good, to kind of rise above our splintered selves and come together for the common good. And, you know, he measures the common good. I love this. He measures the common good, by the life available to the most marginalized, the most vulnerable, you know, the weakest, the most oppressed among us. That's the measure of the common good, is how they're doing. But I'm curious to ask you two, and maybe I'll begin with you this time, Ralph. How is community, solidarity, how does that help us to deal with racism? How does that fuel our ability to engage in anti-racism and racial justice?
I think that as Pope Francis certainly, if not just implies, I think he says very implicitly, is that community is essential for achieving the common good. That folks having encounters, walking with each other, recognizing a shared humanity, recognize the importance of communal survival. That absent that we won't survive as a humanity. He's very bold in making that statement. It talks about the importance of coming together, encounter, dialogue, and dialogue with a kind of ear that's not judgmental, but a listening with the heart, if you will, of being very, very, very sensitive to what folks are dealing with, without being judgmental, and as individuals and as broader communities. You know, encourages folks to walk together, to be together, to share together, and build community and work on shared values.
Yeah, Olga, let me also kind of add to this. You know, one of the things that Ralph mentioned, I probably should have included in that question, and that is, Pope Francis emphasizes dialogue, real dialogue, so much throughout the encyclical. I wonder if that might not be part of the way in which community, could be a vehicle for, addressing racism.
Yeah, for sure. I think I agree with everything Ralph just mentioned, and I want to sort of answer this question. I want to point to something Ralph said in his previous answer, which we were talking about the change that happened around the officer who shot and killed George Floyd. That change happened because people were recording these instances of racial violence. People mobilized together and organized to raise awareness and to get people talking about this in a way that they hadn't before. And I think that kind of dialogue, that kind of community, people coming together, believing in their power, believing in what they're capable of doing, I think that's what Pope Francis understands. And that, I think, is sort of what he is pushing ultimately with Fratelli Tutti. I think he understands that there is power in people coming together. Like Ralph said, if we are to survive, we have to come together as a community. And he really, really believes that and promotes this idea that we can come together and create the society that truly embodies what it means to live like Christ. And he understands that the powerful people who have most of the world's resources, they need us. They need us, but they have conditioned us to believe that we are somehow less worthy because we are not as wealthy, we are not as powerful, we don't have as many resources. And he's really pushing us as Catholics in particular to realize that, no, wait a minute. The power is not in all of these people who are hoarding wealth. The power is in us as a community believing in the common good, believing that if someone is suffering in any part of the world, then that is an obstacle to my freedom. If anyone is being deprived of their human dignity, that is an obstacle for my freedom. And I think he's really challenging us to understand that there is power in community, there is power in organizing. We just have to figure out, again, how to talk to each other and how to teach each other. Because again, I am going to be 32 this year, and it took me encountering intellectuals and scholars on Twitter to start being able to have this conversation and to talk in this way. And I think that's why, as you were saying, Steve, dialogue is a critical part of this, because we have to be in dialogue with each other. And I think you mentioned this in the document too, like local conflicts. I think the language is he refers to local conflicts at one point, and conflict is okay. It's okay to be a community that loves each other and has disagreements, right? We see this in our families all the time, but we can't let capitalism exploit those differences, right? And instead, we have to use it to build each other up. And that, again, is what is the most powerful part of this document, that it's really saying, hey, there is power in all of us mobilizing together and fighting all of these oppressive systems. And that's what I think he means when he says, hey, community really will save us, but we have to do the work to build that community.
Let me.
I think he. Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. No,
Ralph, I was just going to say, that Olga sparked a thought in mind, is that, he talks about the importance of confronting the oppressors. He even refers to them as being oppressors, confronting the oppressors, but loving them, but confronting them nonetheless, that confronting them with love and being able to forgive them, but not forgetting the oppression. That we realize and understand that there is pain and lament and internal work that needs to be done. And I think the church, particularly the Catholic Church, is uniquely situated in that when it's at its best, when it's doing what it preaches, it can be that convening force. It can be that force that allows for organizing, allows for communities to come together. When it can allow for that lament, that reconciliation, and as that confrontational where necessary of those systems. When it's at its best, it can do all of those kinds of things. But I think sadly there's a degree of lacking that spirit to do that.
Well, I'm going to come back to our church and these questions, toward the end. But I have one other topic I want to talk about just a little bit. This kind of builds from the discussion that we just had about dialogue and community and solidarity and so forth. And this one's a tricky one, I think, for me. I'm struck by how the encyclical wants to overcome the divisions that are splintering us, not only racist divisions, but class, ideology, political polarization, and even nationalism. Yet at the same time, the encyclical encourages identifying with real communities. He speaks, for example, of indigenous peoples communities with glowing terms, and of neighborhoods and ethnicities. And while he doesn't say this about the Black community or the brown community in the United States, I mean, I would imagine that it would extend to that as well. But how does being in community work if I'm identifying with my ethnicity, or if I'm identifying with my Black community or whatever it is? How does that help us overcome divisions like racism? Ralph, I'll give you the hard one.
I was doing my best not to make eye contact.
I noticed you were trying to hide. Yeah.
but I would say that, and he did this in a later writing in the Let Us Dream, and when he talks about what constitutes a people, And he says, peoples are not defined by geography or borders, but oftentimes people are defined, or even culture, that people are defined by the kinds of goals and values that they have in common. So I think, in terms of and Fratelli Tutti, he talks about this, redefining what community is, that how big is our we when we say we, that if we is exclusion, it excludes folks, then our we isn't very big. But how can we create a we that includes persons who find themselves struggling, who find themselves in people of different ethnicities, who find themselves of different denominations, different neighborhoods, different income comes. If you took the we and they included representatives of all of the characters in the Good Samaritan story.
I love this. Yeah.
Then your we is very, very powerful. Then your we and your community can call itself and refer to it as a community. But to the degree that folks are missing or alienated or pushed to the side or ignored, then they're not allowed to be in the story that talks about wholeness.
I think that's a brilliant answer.
Yeah,
Olga, I don't think you can top it.
No. I don't think I can, and I want to just echo that everything Ralph said was super spot on, because I think you're absolutely right, Ralph. I think people get caught up in, well, if we are going to center local communities, or if we are going to center specific communities, then we're somehow going to erase a part of who we are. And I think, again, that ties into the very individualistic culture that we have been conditioned to internalize. And I love what Ralph was saying. We need to get creative about what we mean when we say community, because I don't see, and again, this is me in the context of 2021 with this encyclical really sort of broadening my mind in new ways. When I think of community, I think of, again, the Good Samaritan, right? What does it mean to have a community where everyone looks different and everyone comes from different communities, can speak different languages, but we're all guided by the one idea that suffering should not exist. Everyone should have the things that they need to live a dignified and safe life. And that's what I think it means to do this community building, to do this work in a way that doesn't erase people's histories, that doesn't erase the very real and violent and traumatic histories that we actually have to sit with and acknowledge, but how do we create a better community? And I think that is often what I feel like a lot of Catholics struggle with. I think they get really caught up in, well, I don't want to be excluded. And you're not being excluded, right? When we're inviting everyone to the table to say, hey, how do we make our church and our world more liberated? How do we make it more Christ-like? And I think that is it's very terrifying to have to reimagine this, but I think it's also exciting to know that so many of us are saying, wait, what does it mean to actually recreate our Catholic spaces in what the parable of the Good Samaritan is, in what it's teaching us, and Ralph was saying, like, what does it mean to rethink who is the we that we're centering in communities? And I think that's what it means to do this community building work, getting really creative about how we define community. Because I think, again, on my capitalism rant, capitalism has also impacted the ways that we define what it means to be a community, to behave and interact with one another. And maybe we need to unlearn that and then say, oh, okay, now that we are outside of that space, what does it mean to think about gospel-centered community,
Right. Well, the last question that I'm going to pose before we open this up to all of the wonderful people that are waiting to ask questions of us is about the church. The Catechism of our church identifies racism as an intrinsic evil. That means that we Catholics, if we're true to our faith, must be actively opposed to it, that we can never tolerate or be indifferent to racism, just as we cannot tolerate and must work actively against other intrinsic evils like abortion. But how well are Catholics following our catechism here? Lay American Catholics, our bishops and clergy, shouldn't our church be doing more to confront the structural sin of racism and the systemic sin of racism? Isn't there something in the encyclical that can guide us in turning the church more fulsomely to address this awful evil? Ralph, would you mind taking a crack at that one?
Sure, and I would only build on something that Olga said is that as church, we find ourselves gathered around many tables. And I think, that in a self-reflection as church, asking ourselves in an honest way, who's missing from the table? Who is not at the table? And asking ourselves in an honest way, what are the things that we hold value as church, hold high in value as church, as parish, as faith community? What are the things that we invest our resources in? What are the things that we preach about on Sunday morning? What are the things that we pray about? What does the sacristy or the church, the inside of the church look like? The sanctuary look like in terms of art, in terms of inclusion? How welcoming is it? Our very questions that Fratelli Tutti kind of alludes to, and I think, in talking about racism and anti-racist work, that to the degree that we're doing nothing to be hospitable or welcoming or engaging against some of the systems, then we're complicit as church. And that to the degree we don't do anything, we're walking by, right? We're walking by the person who's beaten and bruised by the side of the road.
Exactly.
As priest and Levite and leader. And I think, in looking at the institutional church, I just say, I get invited to a lot of meetings, and one of the first things I do is look to see, if yet again I'm going to be the only person of color in the room or in the meeting.
Wow.
I mean, it's a judgment I make, almost immediately about the quality of what the meeting is going to be. Every time that there's a new bishop that's being named, I used to rush to my cell phone at 6 o'clock in the morning to see, and hopeful that, there was going to be another African-American bishop that was going to be named. But I've stopped doing that because there hadn't been one named in so long. I look to see, just sadly, in terms of, seminarians, African-American seminarians who are leaving because they feel that the church is not working hard enough to understand. So those are some of the institutional type things that I would say, how the churches and parishes invest in local businesses, for example, that struggle. I mean, there's tons of ways that we could do, but we have to ask ourselves, are we part of the problem? And if we are, what are we willing to do to correct it? And it may cause us to use some of our resources like the Good Samaritan did. It may cause us to be a little bit in danger, in jeopardy of losing some resources. It may cause us to make a public declaration that we're helping. We want to do what we're doing, and we want to join other faith communities with. I'm rambling, but it's a long answer to your question.
No, it was a moving answer to the question.
Yeah,
Well,
I want to jump in, and thank you for sharing that, Ralph, because I think you're absolutely right. I often do a lot of what you described as well. Whenever I'm invited into spaces, I need to be very intentional about saying, okay, am I the only woman of color in this space? How is this institution that I'm associating myself extending power and access to other people? And I think that is one thing that I think our church needs to do more of. I think that it needs to not just be Black people in this church who are having this conversation. I think every white person in every part of their life with any kind of power needs to ask themselves, is this something that's exclusive to white people? Are people of color, people from marginalized groups being centered? Why not? Because I think, again, this is what Pope Francis says in Fratelli Tutti, right? Community building is an active and consistent process. Doing this type of liberatory work is an everyday process. And I think every single day, especially if you are a white Catholic person in our church and country with money, you need to ask yourself, how can I allocate the power that I have to create resources and space for other people? And I think that that's what I want to see more of. I was really, really happy to see people following George Floyd's death last year, the first summer of the pandemic. It was really, really enlightening to see Catholics who were stepping up in ways, supporting mutual aid, supporting organizers on the ground, priests who were doing this work, bishops, individual bishops who were releasing statements. But I still think that we need to not forget that energy, and we need to bring for lack of a better description, the passion of this encyclical with us into this year and all years, because it can't just be Ralph it can't just be Ralph and Olga and every other Catholic of color saying like, hey, is this another thing where we are the only Black and brown people allowed in this space? And I think that's what we need to do more of. And I think the encyclical is perfect for that. I think the encyclical tells us, okay, there's power in building community. Build your community, center it in the lessons of the parables of the Good Samaritan, center it in the gospel, center it in what Christ has done. And I think there's so much there for us to do this work. But white Catholics in particular have to really understand that a lot of the onus in anti-racism work has to be placed on the shoulders of white Catholics. And I think that it is okay to have to carry that burden. I think that that is a very real part of doing anti-racism work for white people.
Before I turn it over to our audience for questions, I want to encourage everybody in our audience tonight to think about these last couple of comments, especially. I hope that we all feel called to engage in this critically important moral cause. With that, if you have not already done so, please post questions in the chat, and Janine will begin fielding them. Janine?
Yes, we've had quite a number of questions come in. Thank you so much to both of you, Olga and Ralph. Very, very engaging discussion. The first question, this goes way back to the beginning, and actually I'm going to pose this one to Olga because I think this is your wheelhouse. Does Pope Francis denounce capitalism in Fratelli Tutti? And follow up, do you see a difference between capitalism and consumerism?
Thank you for that. Honestly, I have been reading Fratelli Tutti on and off for the past week, so I don't want to explicitly say that Pope Francis is as critical of capitalism as I've been on this call. But I do think that throughout his papacy, he's used very critical language of consumerism. And I think that even if he's not explicitly condemning imperialism and capitalism in the same way that I am, I think that the sentiment is still there. And I think that he is really, again, I mentioned this earlier, really challenging us to figure out what that looks like, to figure out what being an anti-capitalist Catholic looks like. And I think that that is what speaks to me the most about Fratelli Tutti. And I'm sorry, Janine, what was the second part of that question? I got a little flustered and
Sure. Sure. The second part was, do you see a difference between capitalism and consumerism?
Got it. I, again, still very early on in my introduction to what it means to be a leftist Catholic. So I will apologize if there are people who are more eloquent about this than I am, but I kind of see them as the same thing. I understand them as sort of existing in the same system. Capitalism is the economic system that creates these conditions, and then consumerism is how we as consumers engage with the system. And I think that consumerism is a consequence of this capitalist system. And I think that that is, again, what Pope Francis is getting at, right? Capitalism creates a system in which we think in order to be happy, in order to guarantee a really comfortable life for our families, then we have to consume and we have to hoard as much as possible, which happened to a lot of us in the pandemic, right? I know really early on, I was terrified that something would happen to my family, that something would happen to my partner. And the first thing I did was, I'm going to go to the supermarket and I'm going to hoard as many resources as I possibly can. But now I'm like, wait a minute, that is not really being communal. And sort of that, those are my understanding of those two terms. Hope that was helpful.
Great. Yeah, perfect. Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Olga. Ralph, I had a question from someone earlier on that said, what role does our evolutionary past in tribalism play in how racism continues through generations with that us versus them mentality? Would you be able to take that one?
That's a very good question, and a very difficult question in terms of I mean, I think that we see that racism is a construct that's been constructed to oppress and keep people down in this country. I often wonder and ask myself, that what is it that is different now in the minds of those folks who are descendants of the folks who didn't see anything wrong with lynching folks, didn't see anything wrong with enslaving folks, didn't see anything wrong with only because of there being some sort of difference. So I think that there is in the United States, I think that the question has to be, especially as it relates to white supremacy, and that there is this this prevailing attitude among some people that unless you're white, you are inferior. And it's African American. It's manifested itself recently in Asian. It has a long history in brown people. And I think, to ask, and again, how am I as a white person contributing to it? And if I'm doing nothing at all, I'm contributing to it. If I'm doing nothing at all, if I'm quiet about it, if I am not currently, working on it constantly, then I'm actually a participant. I'm actively participating when I'm doing nothing. Which I know it sounds like an oxymoron. I'm participating as I'm doing nothing, but you're participating when you're doing nothing.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's that old adage, if your silence can speak volumes. We had quite a few questions, and I'll open this up to both of you about how do you engage a parish that maybe wants to look at, to actively look at anti-racism, especially where there are so many white Catholics that don't acknowledge racism as a problem. One person was typing the fact that she had encountered a graduate of University of Notre Dame who would not even acknowledge that racism is a problem. His answer was, that hasn't been proven. So how do you respond? How do you begin to respond to somebody with that mindset? And who do you invite into dialogue? Olga, do you want to start?
Sure, I will start. I will admit that is very, very difficult. I think especially for Catholics of color, I think it's very difficult for us to, at least for me personally, I try to enter into dialogue in what I consider to be sort of safe spaces. So I'll go on panels and answer questions. But on an intimate personal level, it is really difficult to have those conversations, especially in parish spaces, whether that's digitally or in person. And I think what has been most helpful for me when I encounter people who say things like, oh, systemic racism is not real, especially if it's someone who I'm saying to myself, okay, this is a fellow human being who you cannot just angrily disregard. So what is this going to look like? So I just remind myself, okay, if I'm trying to actually think about this as community building, if I'm thinking of this as an opportunity to, as Pope Francis says, change someone's heart, then what I often just say to someone is, well, why do you think that's the case? Why do you think that systemic racism doesn't exist? And I think often what I've encountered, and this isn't always successful, again, this is just one person's way of doing this, I often find that in the process of introducing that question and having someone figure out how to explain to a Black Catholic that systemic racism doesn't exist, we might not get to a common ground and I might not have changed their hearts, but they take the first step in realizing, oh, okay, wait a minute. Talking this out loud with someone doesn't make it seem as right. And again, you're not necessarily focused on changing hearts. You're not working on changing them from the left to the right or vice versa. It's just a matter of, okay, explain to me how you arrived at that realization. And that is, if you're trying to start dialogue, I think that's often a really helpful way to approach that conversation. But again, I will preface that or add this to say that like people of color also can be weary about having those conversations because it is very, very exhausting. And Ralph mentioned this when we were having the earlier part of the conversation. We have a lot of feelings that we also can't bring into these spaces that we have to create very specific spaces for. So I think just understand that those conversations are going to look different depending on who you're having them with and in what space you're having them in.
Right. Ralph, anything to add?
Sure. The only thing I would add is that there is that oftentimes people of color need messengers to take the message into the pit. I've grown weary of taking the message because for years people would ask me to come do racism workshops in parishes and things over the years, and people would look at me and they would nod and say, "That's nice. That's sour grapes. He's upset because he didn't get a job." Mm-hmm. But when I had a colleague who would deliver the exact same message with the exact same PowerPoint that I had, mm-hmm. for whatever the reason they believed, and I had I didn't feel bad that the message got received a little bit better because it came from him. I was just glad that the message got received. Mm-hmm. The only thing I would add, is a constant effort to ask, is it I, Lord? Is it mm-hmm. could this be could I be the one harboring the racist attitudes and racist opinions? I've been around for a while, and I have yet to find only one person that I know has actually admitted to being a racist, a white person who admitted to being racist himself. I challenged him when I was 14 years old, when I found he was paying someone who was, he was a brother in the Catholic school where I went. He was paying my classmate more than me for the same work. And I wasn't even sure that I had a good working definition of racism, but I went to him and said, brother, I'm gonna say his last name, brother, you're racist. And he said, I am. And he went through all of these reasons why he was and how he got to be. He said, I am, but I promise you, Ralph, I'm working on it. I'm doing everything I can. And, you bring this to my attention helps, but I know that I'm harboring bad feelings toward people of color and toward yourself. And I didn't have any benefit of racism workshops, books, or anything at the time. I just knew I wasn't being treated right.
Right.
So I think, that in his case, I have, tremendous respect for him now, God rest his soul. But the reality of him being able to admit it at that time, I think that we can use a whole lot more of that to say, maybe I should work on X. And after I get X fixed, I need to work on Y too. And then I need to look at all of the institutions that I'm a part of, that I contribute to, that I interact with, the organizations that I belong to, all of those. Right. How are we perpetuating this?
Wonderful. Did you have something to say, Steve? Yeah,
just really short. I think there's a special onus on white Catholics to speak up when we hear these kinds of things. I mean, it's really on us to step up at this moment and confront comments like whoever this person from Notre Dame was. I mean, it's we can't be silent. To be silent is to be the Levite and the priest. We cannot be silent.
Absolutely. Okay, we've got another one about for Olga. This is actually, a couple of people have mentioned this. Well, we don't really see in our US culture or our Catholic culture abandoning capitalism anytime soon. So how do we move forward with Fratelli Tutti within a capitalist framework, or shift the conversation and focus? Is there an alternative to capitalism?
Right. And I think that is very real. I think even being very critical of capitalism, we're not going to abolish it tomorrow, right? And people have very real material conditions that they have to live with every day. We have to pay our rent, we have to pay our schools, we have to pay for food. So I think in order to think about working with Fratelli Tutti within the capitalist system that we are currently in, I think, again, it means thinking about community building. It means thinking about who is suffering in front of you. Like Ralph mentioned a few times, how often are you walking by the person who is bruised and ignoring their suffering? How often are you not challenging yourself to think about conflicts that are happening all across the world and challenging yourself to think about how to become engaged as Catholics? I think that's the message of Fratelli Tutti right there. Like, what does it mean to build community where you are, but also remembering that we are a part of the universal Catholic family, right? And again, that could be very different for a lot of people. That could mean organizing, that can mean hosting workshops like what we're doing today, or that can mean starting a book club where you talk to people about what Catholicism can teach us about the struggles happening in the Middle East, right? I think that Fratelli Tutti is just challenging us to think about what it means to build community and build power as a Catholic family. And so, yes, we're not going to abolish capitalism tomorrow, but if we're working toward a system that says, hey, we need to think about people over profit, then how can we do that in our everyday life, right? How can, for example, for me, something that I'm challenging myself to do in the new year, I'm very much that typical Bronx New Yorker who's like, I don't talk to my neighbors. I don't know who my neighbors are. I'm not going to say hello to them when I see them in the hallway. But then the first, in January, the first week of January, there was a manhole explosion outside of our apartment, and we lost power for a couple of days. And that was a moment where I was like, okay, in moments like this, what does it mean to be a community? What does it mean to say to your neighbor, hey, I'm here if you need me? And that's something that I've been challenging myself to do, to say, hey, how do you become a resource for the people on your floor, right? And it starts with something small. But again, I think that's how Fratelli Tutti is challenging me to say, okay, how can you build community where you are right now in this part of the world? Because yes, Olga Segura is not going to abolish capitalism from all the way from the Bronx, but I can help people start thinking about what it means to do that work on a day-to-day basis. And I think, again, survival, like Ralph was saying, to survive, we need each other. So we need to talk about what that looks like, right? And we don't all need to agree that capitalism is evil. We just all need to agree that nobody should be suffering, right? So I think that that is a way to think about what it means to create power and community without necessarily abolishing capitalism right away. So I hope that was helpful.
Yeah.
And I would say that until Olga is successful at abolishing capitalism, let's work on greed. Let's work on individualism. Let's work on consumerism. Let's work on hoarding. Let's work on those kinds of things until, and I think, that there are, things like, and this is a shameless plug for Catholic Campaign for Human Development, like worker-owned co-ops. There are things like job training type efforts that we can support as parish, and the Catholic Church is supporting some of these worker-owned co-ops that we can have a bit of a bite out of some sort of alternative type economy that doesn't oppress. So until that happens, there are things we can do.
And I'd like to make my own shameless plug. We are actually having our 4th discussion on Fratelli Tutti. We'll be focused on economics. So I invite you both back, Olga and Ralph.
Which is next Wednesday.
Is that the next Wednesday one? I can't remember which. We still have several questions if we've got time.
Sure.
Steve? Okay.
Yeah, we've got about 6 minutes.
Okay. This is when our conversation turned to the church, what responses do you have to certain bishops, such as Bishop Robert Barron, who has such a huge social media following, who criticize wokeness? He has spoken out strongly against racism, however, has criticized the Black Lives Matter movement and people who talk about being woke. So what would your responses to somebody like that be? Right, Ralph, why don't you start with that one?
As full disclaimer, I work for 300 bishops, but
oh right.
I would say that as I would say to a bishop, or as I would say to anyone, I mean, there is a bit of a danger in being critical of. I mean, to say that being critical of Black Lives Matter as a movement versus being critical of Black Lives Matter as a concept. And I would say, that I think, we have an opportunity to not, criticize and even being critical of something that's something like wokeness. And in my mind, my definition of wokeness is that you're aware of what's happening in your community in a way that you're willing to do something about it. That does not. I'm recognizing the fact that there's other definitions out there. That other folks have the other definitions, but for me, that's what it means. So I think that there's a danger in kind of criticizing the kind of keywords. For the longest time, Black Lives Matter didn't even have an address, but it was a movement, a tremendous movement. If you wanted to send them a letter or a donation, you couldn't do it. But still, people look for ways to come out and be critical of it. So that's how I would respond. I think if asked for my opinion from one of my 300 bosses.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with Ralph. I think that wokeness, the understanding of what it means to be quote unquote woke, just means someone who is actively challenging themselves to do a lot of the work that we see Pope Francis is calling us to do, right? It means acknowledging that there are systems of oppression. It means acknowledging that they're suffering and talking about ways to make that better. I think that a lot of bishops in the past year, or not even in the past year, since the Black Lives Matter movement was created, I think there's this genuine unwillingness and fear to engage with something that is moving very, very fast, and it's moving a lot faster than our church moves. And I think that a lot of bishops see that as a reason to doubt it or to view it with suspicion. And I think that that is the world that we're in, right? We're in the digital age. Things move a lot faster, and that is a good thing, right? People should be moved. We shouldn't be moving incrementally as a church and as a nation and a world when people are dying. And I think whenever I hear bishops, church leaders become obsessed with critiquing woke culture, you need to spend less time critiquing woke culture and talking about, hey, how are you actively working to challenge the suffering that we're seeing in your parishes all across the country, all across the world? And I think that we need to be less focused. Like, yes, there's actual polarization that exists because, again, a capitalist structure thrives off of polarization and thrives off of us being divided. But again, if we're going to take the message of Fratelli Tutti to heart, then we have to understand that, yes, we might disagree with this, but we all are still working for the same common good, for the same common goal. And I think bishops should engage with organizers who are part of this movement, because they are doing the work that our bishops are not. And they know what should be done. They know what our communities want. And again, we've been talking about dialogue as being a part of community building. Bishops need to do this type of community building too. So I would love to see less time being critical of certain buzzwords and more time saying like, hey, I'm gonna sit down with a young Black organizer and have them explain to me what it means to do this work.
I think that's a fantastic wrap up. You know, I do still have several questions. I'm trying to be conscious of the time.
We have about another couple minutes.
A couple minutes. We had one fellow say, I'm a fellow Black Catholic millennial, and I'm called to evangelize. As the only Catholic in my family, there is a great opportunity for this, yet never before have I seen such explicit or implicit racism within Catholic spaces. This leaves me at a loss for inviting others who look like me into those spaces. Thoughts or advice?
Yeah, I'll start off. I'm really sorry that that is your experience, because that's really unfortunate, right? That causes actual spiritual devastation for us. Absolutely. As a community of Catholics of color trying to exist in white Catholic spaces. But one thing, and again, this is not like the solution to all of this, because again, the solution is abolishing any kind of oppression. But I think one thing that has been helpful for me in the past year, especially, this ties to what Ralph was saying, reimagining what it means when we think about community, what it means to be a Catholic community. I have found it really consoling in the past year to create digital spaces like this, where yes, it's not a mass, it's not an in-person service, but it's a Black and brown space where it's Black and brown Catholic women who meet together and who talk about their whatever they might be struggling with that week. And that makes it easier for me to then exist in those white Catholic spaces, because I think it's okay for right now, for us as, especially for women of color in Catholic spaces, I think it's okay for us to say, you know what, we don't feel safe stepping into predominantly white Catholic spaces, so we're gonna have to carve out communities that are different for us. And again, I'm not arguing it's changing entire structures in our church, but I think it's okay to create separate spaces that are going to supplement our weekly worship, because I think we need that right now. I think that it's important for us to create those spaces for ourselves. But I'll let Ralph, if he wants to say anything else.
The only thing I would add is, as a fellow Black Catholic millennial, that really wasn't supposed to be that funny, but I would say that this is similar to what Olga was saying. You know, that back there used to be a model of public housing where that everyone had their own little separate space, and there was like a room in the middle, like the day space, where everybody would come and gather for meals and those kinds of things. And I would say that you create ways where you create a family reunion, where you go to one of those rooms where people who are like-minded like you, maybe same culture, maybe different culture, but people who are like-minded, where you can go in that room and affirm each other, then you encourage each other, that you become emboldened, and you come re-energized to be able to come back out into the bigger space, to, you know, so that you can come out and you can affirm your Blackness, you can bring your Blackness, you can be bold, that you'll be able to speak with that kind of, and maybe even bring some of the folks from your room, your space with you. But you find those oftentimes those underground spaces where you can have the kind of conversation, interaction, where you can be yourself. You know, and I remember Saint Pope John Paul II, when he thanked us back in 1987. Obviously, none of the millennials were there, but 1987, he thanked us and said, "Infuse the church with the gift of your Blackness." I mean, I remember that like it was yesterday, and that keeps me here. That keeps me here. So I mean, that says that I don't have to conform to anything else other than who I am.
Very beautiful. Thank you both so much. We've had such engaging conversation in the chat. Thank you.
I too want to thank Olga and Ralph. Wow, it's just been an extraordinary evening, and I'm just so grateful for both of you. And speaking of grateful, let me thank all the staff who handled all of this, take care of everything behind the scenes. Janine picking up all those questions, and special thanks to all of the sponsors for these programs. And huge thanks to the audience that has stayed with us through this very challenging and interesting, and yet at the same time, kind of hope-filled conversation that we've been having. I want to say really quickly that next week, next Wednesday, we will be holding another one of these conversations on Fratelli Tutti and economics. So those of you who have an opinion one way or another about Olga's comments on capitalism will have a chance to discuss it a little bit more directly. And with that, I'd like to introduce Nolan Ainsworth. Nolan is an intern with Franciscan Action Network, our organization, and he's in the process of formation to become a Franciscan friar. So Nolan will close us this evening with a prayer. Nolan?
All right, thank you, Steve. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. Lord, you reveal yourself in the Trinity as total self-gift. You call us blessed when we give ourselves to our brothers and sisters, especially the hungry and thirsty. In this time of racial reckoning, remind us of our common brotherhood and sisterhood, and may we align with those thirsting and hungering for racial justice. May we move forcefully against the powers of racism in all their forms. May your love humble our efforts and sustain us in this fight. We ask this through our Lord Jesus Christ, who lives and reigns with you and the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Nolan, and thank you, everyone. God bless you.